is producing podcasts. I'm really happy that I'm here today because I love podcasts, I love what I do, and I love talking about it. So I'm at your disposal for any questions you will have afterwards, after I have to say some things to introduce what podcasts are. I assume that everyone knows iPods. That's how the term podcast began. It was the audio that it was meant to be listened on iPods. Eventually, it grew, it became something much more. Now we have many options. There are shows, there are vodcasts, which have the video element inside as well. And it began in 2005. They gained a very big publicity in the States back in 2014. And the audience in Cyprus and Greece got to know them really well back in 2016, and they skyrocketed 2020. I guess we can all assume why. So yeah, the quarantine was a big boost for everyone who was locked at home to seek for new content to consume. And podcasts were there, and they were the easy option. And they are a much better option for most of the listeners, for being more versatile, more direct, and having a more genuine approach to any subject rather than the traditional media, either radio, newspapers, or TV. I want to mention a funny meme that I recently saw that it said, did anyone tell men that they can go to a psychologist and they don't have to do a podcast to tell their problems? It's partially true because you can see a lot of podcasts that they don't really have a subject or a content, which it's basically the host talking about the issues that they face. That's acceptable, but you really need to have like a concept and a specific theme, a genre that you want to talk about, because that's what the audience like. I'm going to come to that more specific. I have two researches. One happened in Greece, and the other one, we did it here in Cyprus, based on the analytics that we get from all the podcasts that we produce, and there are 15 currently. So we have quite a few analytics. Who's listening to podcasts? According to the research and the analytics we're getting, 60% are female, women. And you're going to understand afterwards why. And then we have a 41%, it's ages 25 to 34. And then we have approximately 30% to ages 18 to 24 and 35 to 54. So basically, all the, let me find the English translation. Δυναμικών κοινών, it's in Greek. Okay, the active listeners, yes, thank you very much. The active, sorry. Yes, the users that are more eligible to consume content, they are the target market for publicists, for advertising companies. So that's why all the market started to convert from the traditional media to the online, such as podcasts. Most of the listeners, a big number, like 90% of them, they have as residency big cities. In Greece, it's of course Athens and Salonika, and in Cyprus, it's mostly Nicosia, Limassol, then Larnaca, and everyone else, it's a very small amount. And the reason we assume that is happening, we can get the answer on the next stat, that 90% of them, of the podcast listeners in Greece and Cyprus, they have a higher education, either a PhD, either a master's degree, and usually you find those people living in big cities due to career. Okay, how many podcasts does the average listener consume? The numbers are 1 to 5. They will pick their favorites amongst a big list of podcasts available now worldwide, but in Cyprus as well. The last time I counted them was about 30, 35, with a very versatile genre. We have history podcast, politics podcast, stand-up comedy podcast, social matters, female empowerment, kids-related podcasts. There is a big amount of content out there. So most of the listeners, they will choose 1 to 5 podcasts to support and be a very dedicated subscriber to them. Some of those podcasts also have a Patreon account. And we can see some of them standing out, building a community that supports them through Patreon and through other social media, such as Facebook groups, Instagram, Twitter accounts, etc., etc. Why do most people seek podcasts? The main reason is to learn new things. That was the excuse given. Another reason is entertainment. And a third reason is to be informed about the latest updates in the community, in politics, or whatever the genre is. 7 out of 10 of podcast listeners, they consume approximately 1 hour in listening podcast per week. That's why some of the podcasts that they have a much bigger duration than 60 minutes, they tend to lose audience. So we see that through many analytics. The best span for a podcast duration is approximately 40 to 50 minutes in order to keep your listeners engaged. Most of the listeners, they dedicate like 2 to 4 days per week. They are their podcast days. And the main activity that they combine with listening podcasts are working and doing δουλειές του σπιτιού. Chores, thank you. Like doing laundry or ironing or cleaning or washing the dishes. That's... Sorry? Sorry? Actually, it kind of does. But yeah, when you're doing chores, podcast is a very good companion. It used to be the TV. The TV was always open. There were things playing. But suddenly, a much more interesting media than the TV came, and many people are using that. When they cook, when they travel, when they commute, either in between cities, either in the airplane, they can download their favorite episodes, their favorite show, and listen it during the flight. When they work out, a lot of people are listening to podcasts when they are going to the gym or when they are running or cycling outdoors. There is also an amount of people who said, I just listen to podcasts, I do nothing at the time that I'm listening to podcasts. People are listening podcasts during their working hours in the office, especially when they have a desk job, and they have like to send many emails, to prepare presentations, to do like an office job. Podcast is a good way to help them concentrate and to keep every other interference outside. So if there is noise in their working environment, if they don't want to get distracted, podcast is the perfect choice for that. And a lot of people are listening to podcasts when they are going into bed at night. They find it very soothing and relaxing, and you can combine that with another activity, because we asked also a lot of the listeners, what other activities do you like besides listening to podcasts? The number one activity that they do is reading books. So that's how we can explain them listening to podcasts when they get in bed. Most of them, a big amount, more than 50%, they listen to podcasts at home. Then we have the car, commuting, when they go for a walk, gym, and at work. The favorite podcast platform is by far, with a percentage of 70%, Spotify. Of course, we have the platforms and the means nowadays to use distribution platforms such as Buzzsprout or Anchor. Anchor actually Spotify bought it now. But you upload your podcast, you create your podcast on Buzzsprout, and you connect it with every podcast platform, such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc., etc. And there are many of them out there. And you upload your podcast on Buzzsprout, and simultaneously it appears on every platform. And you get all your analytics from all the platforms on Buzzsprout. So yeah, Spotify is the most popular. Then we have Apple, Google Podcasts, and YouTube now. And okay, how do people get informed about podcasts? Mostly from mentions on other podcasts. So the podcasting community, when they interact with each other, they gain more listeners. I'm going to give you an example afterwards on some of the podcasts that we produce, to be more specific about that. Search engines, so they go online and they, I want a podcast about sports. They get recommendations. Mouth to mouth from friends and family or coworkers. One is recommending podcasts, interesting podcasts to one another. Now, interaction with the hosts is very important to grow the podcast's audience and keep them as fans. They want, because it's a very direct way of entertainment, they feel the hosts that they listen for many hours every week, every month. They consider them their friends. They consider them persons they know. Same impact someone has with an actor or a journalist that they see on TV. Same thing happening with the podcast, with a more direct way. They will find them on social media, they will follow them, they will send them private messages, they will discuss about the podcast online on platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter, and they will get as bigger interaction as is available to them. There are some podcasts that they also do live recordings every once in a while, and that was proven very successful because you can see live recordings with an audience more than 100 people willing to be there, witness the recording, meet the host in person, and get to feel part of a bigger community and a family. Most of the podcast listeners are heavy users of Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, WhatsApp, TikTok, and Pinterest. And as I mentioned before, what other activities they like besides listening to podcasts is reading books, working out, cooking. Those are the 3 top activities for podcast listeners. Now, to get more specific with more examples, we started producing. I got introduced to podcasts back in 2014 when I was living in London. That's when I decided that I want to come back to Cyprus and I want to do that thing, amongst other. But podcast was one of the things that we wanted to do. So we started in 2016, before it even got popular, and doing some shows / podcasts in a custom-made studio that we created. We were distributing them on a frequent base, on a weekly base. And then in 2020, the first purely audio podcast was produced. The name of that podcast is Historicon, and it's at this moment the top podcast in Cyprus in every aspect. It has, up to date, more than 400,000 downloads, and we have an average of 25 to 30,000 downloads per month. And it created a huge community. We're doing live recordings once a month or once every 2 months with an audience of an average of 200 people. If that podcast were anywhere else besides Cyprus, we were going to be talking numbers in millions. But we are in Cyprus. That's what we have, and that's what we have to deal with. And the thing I mentioned before, that interaction of hosts between different podcasts is something that really helps. We were very lucky to have Historicon as a part of our platform and as our production, because every new podcast that we start producing, we find a way to introduce the host and the new podcast through Historicon, and that helps a lot, because immediately that podcast will gain audience. When we started Historicon, we had literally 50 downloads per episode. That's a good starting number for a podcast, but it's not good to stay there. And we were very anxious at the beginning. Oh, Cypriots are not ready for the podcast. No one is going to listen to them. But we firmly believed that we need to have the consistency and to keep doing it. And that worked out. The audience came. We found many ways to advertise through social media, because yes, we produce the podcast, yes, we put it on the platforms, but you need to communicate it to the audience. And of course, social media is the way to do that. Sorry for the too many M's. The thing now, today, in 2023, is that a lot of people want to produce their podcast. And that's perfect, because podcasts do not compete against each other. They compete together because they're building the community, and one person that is listening to one podcast eventually is going to seek for other podcasts to listen as well. What we see in numbers is that podcasts that get to be produced by traditional media do not succeed. Because what tends to happen is that the traditional media go with the same mindset they applied on TV or radio, and they apply the same mentality on their podcast. The podcast audience, they went to the podcast because they wanted something different. They wanted it to be more direct, more humane, to listen to everyday people talk the way they talk with their friends. Having a specific subject, a genre for your podcast, does help a lot, because each listener knows that I'm going to hear every single episode of that podcast, because every single episode has a specific subject, and if I miss it, I'll miss something good, something I like. While podcasts that have a very general thematologia, subject, if someone misses an episode, they're not missing something important. Also, I'm going back on the podcast duration. As we mentioned, most of the people will consume the podcast while doing chores, while commuting, while working out. We know that the duration of that activity tends to be between half an hour and 1 hour. If a podcast lasts much longer, no one will listen in. Or they will listen it in 3 to 4 sessions, but they will skip and miss all the other episodes you will air in between. What do you need to produce a podcast? First of all, an idea. You need an idea. You need to talk to someone, to a friend, to someone who is doing a podcast, and mention your idea. Talk to family. Talk to the people around you. Talk to coworkers. Talk to your boss, and pitch them the idea. If you see a good response, that means you have something solid. If you don't see them getting excited, that doesn't mean that your idea is not good. It just means that it needs development. Every idea is good. It just needs the proper treatment, the proper twist that will make it more interesting for other people. When you have your idea, you have to start deciding some things. Okay, how many episodes I'm going to do? I'm just starting to do a podcast and I'm going to do it indefinitely. Creating seasons in your head helps a lot. You can say, okay, I'm going to do 10 episodes. I'm going to call it season 1. And I'm going to come back, see the analytics, see the response, and maybe launch 10 more episodes afterwards, or maybe launch 100 episodes afterwards. But doing compartmentalizing it helps a lot for you to grow it steadily. Because from the first 10 episodes that you will call season 1 to the next 10 episodes that you will call season 2, you can do improvements. You can get into a better studio, get better equipment, change the subject a bit, change the format a bit. What is going to be the format? Is it going to be you talking and saying a story? Is it going to be you interviewing a person? Is it going to be you with a co-host discussing about a specific subject? It can be whatever you want. You just need to be adamantine about that and support it. You need to be sure that I believe in this concept, and this is the reason why I'm doing this concept. I want to have a co-host because if I want to talk about medicine and I have zero clue about medicine, I need a co-host that knows the subject to participate with me and be able to bring a more professional opinion on the table. Then go into production. The podcast needs a name. Then you need a microphone and a recording platform. There are many options for microphones. You don't need to spend like thousands of euros to buy the high-end microphone and build a studio and do all that kind of stuff if you want to produce your podcast. We literally started with a 100 € microphone in a room. That was it. The cost was the 100 € we gave for the microphone. Then, of course, the editing, that there are many free softwares out there that you can edit your podcast, and the subscription of the platform that you will host it. That subscription, if Buzzsprout that I mentioned before, is approximately $11 to $12 per month. If you think you have a great idea, maybe you can pitch it to one of the existing podcast channels that there are 4 or 5 out there right now. There's Netcast Zone, there's Blitz, there is us, Black Lemon. I'm sure there are others as well, but these are the 3 main that they produce more than one type of podcast. But you can also take the initiative and do it totally on your own. If you have logistic support on some things, it's much better. You will get a better start, perhaps, but that doesn't mean that if you start it on your own, it will not succeed. Now, I'm gonna go a little bit in the public sector, since I'm guessing you are more interested on that aspect. What tends to happen is like big companies or public sector, they want to do a podcast and they don't have a long-term plan in their heads. If you're a big company or a big, like a ministry or a service or whatever, you need to have plans. It's not the same as an individual, which is okay to do 10 episodes and then disappear. You are an organization that you are gonna build on your consistency. And having a strategy before starting the launch of your first episode is very crucial. Because I have seen many examples that they started doing their own podcast because they wanted to do something very specific they had in their minds. And they launched 3, 4, 5 episodes, and then they disappeared. You need to have a strategy if you are a public sector organization or a ministry or a big company. You also have the option, since we have many, many podcasts out there, to come and adopt one of those podcasts that they are as close as possible to the subject that you want to promote. And you might find that a bit strange, that, okay, that podcast already exists. Why shall I go and have a collaboration with them? Because it's a win-win situation and it gives a better prospect for what you have in mind, and you can step out of that collaboration when you see that you want to stop doing that at any given moment. I don't want to keep talking for much longer. I want to have like a discussion. I'm not going to call it a Q&A, it's a discussion. So please shoot me with questions about anything we've talked or not, and I will do my best to answer. Yes, please.
Interesting presentation.
Can I have your name, please?
Athanasia.
Nice to meet you, Athanasia.
You personally have a subject you want to promote in your podcast?
One of the things that is part of our strategy, and we really feel, and we are fighting towards that direction, it's basically all the subjects that are getting buried in traditional social media. We promote a lot subjects of female empowerment, of equal rights, of inclusiveness. We promote subjects bi-communal. So everything that you will not find on traditional social media, we want to do it. We give our platform and our resources to young creators, to students, that will not be able to have a TV show or a radio show. And we give them the resources to produce what they want to produce through us. So yeah, you can say that we're trying to do everything that others will try to avoid. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Yannis.
Hi, Annie.
So when you invite someone, either a politician or I don't know, a scientist or someone else to chat about something which is interesting,
Yes.
and the other person promotes a racist idea or a homophobic idea or whatever, how do you protect yourself and your audience?
I protect myself in advance because I know who I'm inviting at the podcast. We and the hosts of each podcast separately, they are people who are aware of the subject that they discuss. For example, we have one podcast, it's called Pints of Politics. Obviously, it talks about politics, and they're drinking beer while doing that. But the hosts, they are people that they have knowledge about the politics, so they know that they will not invite an extremist opinion on their podcast because it's not something that we want to promote. They're not going to invite someone from the far right. They're not going to invite a racist, a homophobic, because we don't want to give, and I'm talking personally as a company, we don't want to give a microphone to those kind of opinions. Thank you.
Andrea, this is Christos.
Hi, Christos.
First, to congratulate you both for this, but also for the development of the Black Lemon TV. I see that it's getting bigger and bigger. That's really good work.
Thank you.
Couple of things. Since we have an audience here of people coming from public sector and organizations, it would be nice and helpful to listen from you of examples that maybe you are aware of organizations like this that have tried and they got into creating a plan and strategy for creating podcasts, and that they created those podcasts, which are these podcasts that you can refer to, so people will know also these kind of examples. And the second thing is to whether you have more data on the comparison between podcast versus vodcast, because it's a big, for me it's a big
confusion.
Not confusion. I
there
mean,
is for us.
If we're gonna go into, because I'm into digital technology for the last 25 years, if I'm gonna go into the production of a podcast and with all the preparation, I might as well add on the video part, where you get many pieces of information from the facial expressions and what's going on between the two people or the three people participating in. So that would be, I think, a big question to answer before you go through.
Thank you for that question.
That's all for now.
So going to the first question, one of the successful examples that one public organization is producing a podcast, it's not for a public consumption. They use it internal. It's SIDA. They are producing a podcast, and when they approached us, they said, we want to do a podcast for our employees. I was like, yeah, okay, and what is going to be the subject? We just want to do a podcast. Then we helped them develop the idea to make it interesting. Why would an employee sit and listen or watch a podcast or a vodcast of the same people that they meet every day talking to each other? So we brought a very happy and interesting aspect to their podcast, and it's going really well. We've done 6 episodes so far, but they decided that they want to keep doing it at least for another year, and that's a success story. So an organization can decide to do something just for an internal use. It's especially a big organization. If you have like 1,000 or 2,000 employees, that not everyone gets to interact with each other on a daily basis, then maybe that is a good option to get closer. Another example that we had recently, it's IDEC, Ίδρυμα Έρευνας και Καινοτομίας, that they wanted to promote something in specific. And they said, we want to do a podcast. I was like, yeah, you want to do how many episodes of a podcast? We don't know. I was like, okay, you want to promote a specific subject, but you don't know what will be the continuation on that. So instead of creating something for 2 or 3 episodes that if you don't get the consistency, maybe no one will listen, how about you using one of the many other existing podcasts that matches that subject and come as a guest on one episode and utilize it that way? Because the other podcast already has an audience that is tech-related. It's the podcast of Hack Cyprus. So everyone there is tech-related, that it has the startup ecosystem listening to that podcast. So they have an immediate connection with IDEC. And it was very successful. Now, I'm going to go on the second question. Podcasts and vodcasts. Why you need the video? Do you have something to show? Or is just because you like to see your face? That's a question that I always tend to do. Do I have something to see from watching you talking? Or is it more beneficial for me to just have the audio and be much easier to see? A podcast, you can listen it during work, during your exercises, or everything we mentioned before, the chores, when you're running outside, when you're cycling. When you add the video and you have your podcast only available on YouTube, you limit the audience. And if you don't have anything interesting to show, like, let me get an example. There are podcasts that you need to see the expressions and people will present something during the podcast, so you need to have a visual. Still, that, if it's just a discussion, is not a good reason to have the camera. It's a very good reason to have a camera recording it for you to promote it afterwards. It's something that we didn't do in the past. The purely audio podcast, we were just recording them. But when we realized that, okay, for the social media promotion, we need to have video material. We are recording the whole episode. We're never gonna air the whole episode in video because I find it very boring to sit and watch 2 people talking for 1 or 1.5 1 or 1.5 hour. I prefer just listening to them. But the trailer that is gonna be produced from the footage, the video material, is gonna help everyone to go to listen the whole episode. So we create a trailer 1.5 minutes max to be able to put it as a reel on Instagram, in Facebook, in TikTok, and through that trailer or highlights video, you can call it whatever you want, we use it as the doorway to the whole episode. This is what you're gonna get if you hear the episode. This is the link of the episode on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. If you wanna hear the rest of it, please be my guest. We see the analytics of YouTube. You can see podcast episodes in YouTube having like tens of thousands of views. if you actually see how many of them keep watching the episode after the first minute, you will realize that there is no need to put it on YouTube. Like, there is a 70% drop after the first minute. So putting so much resources in putting it on YouTube, whilst you can emphasize on promoting the audio-only part, which will have a more, sorry, not organic, ουσιαστική, a more essential audience, that is much better for your podcast. Did that answer your question? If you have anything to ask more, please do.
It's a matter of, it's a matter of course, resources, as you said.
Yeah.
It's a matter of prioritization,
Yeah.
also audience that you're targeting to. And it's just for me, is if you have the equipment, I mean, you can post it in multiple media, both audio and the video. I mean, I caught myself wanting sometimes to see the video part, just to see the facial expression of those people and try to detect myself of what they're saying.
Yes.
It depends. But as you said, it's a matter of prioritization, resources, decisions, audience, and so on. So yeah, we agree.
If editing a video, a 1 hour video, it's gonna take you minimum 2 hours. So if you have that time to spend, that's okay. If that time spent is not worth of the return that it will bring you, then there is no reason to do it. You will see it eventually through the analytics. Okay, more people listen to me on a mobile device during work time. So, okay, they're listening through Spotify. So, okay, I'm gonna focus my resources more to promote Spotify. Other questions? Yes, please.
Andrea, this is Kyriaki from EMN Cyprus.
Hi, Kyriaki.
And we are thinking of doing some podcasts on migration
Perfect.
and asylum-related topics. So I wanted to ask, how many questions do you have to write the questions in advance? And if yes,
Perfect
how
question.
many?
Yes.
I guess it's an open-ended discussion you have with the person opposite to you, but let's say it's an hour, the duration is an hour podcast on these topics, quite serious topics. How many questions do you have to have in advance?
Perfect, thank you very much. The great thing about podcasts or online shows is that you don't have the rules and regulations of TV. So it's okay for one episode to be 30 minutes, and the next one to be 40, and the third one to be 50. As long as the discussion is interesting, you can go to any duration you want. Don't go up to 2 hours, it's no needed. Or you can go up to 2 hours and break it into 2 parts. That's also a policy that we use sometimes. Now, for your question, I'm gonna give you an example. We are currently producing, and it's going as a public organization podcast, the podcast of the youth organization, ONEC. It's called Youthcast. They started producing it on their own before they approached us. And when they came to us, we, let's say, tidied up a little bit and gave some suggestions on how to produce it better and how to promote it better. It's going really well, and we expanded our collaboration for the next 3 years, so it's going that well. And there is an advertising agent in between through us and the youth organization for that podcast. The youth organization decides the guest. I am the host. The advertising agency gives me a list of 10, 12 questions to have them as not a template, to have like bullet points of the discussion. At the beginning, they really wanted me to do the questions. Like, we gave you the questions, stick on that questions. Lucky as I didn't accept that. And I told them, I'm gonna have your questions in mind, but I'm gonna listen what my guest will say, and I'm gonna interact with my guest based on what I listen, having in mind your questions. And that worked, because I have seen many podcasts, I have listened many podcasts, and I have seen many interviews, and I always, as a listener, hate it when the guest says things and the host just goes to the next question because they have an agenda. Forget about your agenda. Be genuine, be present, be at the moment, and listen what your guest is saying, because it's gonna give you much better material than the one that you prepared. So 10 to 12 questions might be enough to produce a podcast around 45 minutes, but I won't call them questions, I would call them bullet points that you will need to go back to if you don't get enough material from your guest that will inspire you to go to many directions. Listen to what he or she have to say, and you will have the next question in his or her answer. Next question, yes.
The other question is, how is it okay if we introduce music into the podcast?
Of course.
Like, what is it a win-win situation of having music background at the back in such a serious topic on migration and asylum? Can we include it?
You mean to have an actual song or have music playing in the background?
Like bits and pieces.
For what reason?
For pausing the whole
No. No. It's okay to have, every podcast we produce has a specific music, either written, either bought for that podcast. But we only use it for the trailer and the promotional material, and at the beginning and at the end of the podcast. If you put music throughout the podcast, it's tiring, because the person who's listening to the podcast considers it a relaxation period. So if you give them too much information at that moment, music, speech, and they are also doing an activity, they will not listen to the whole podcast. They will get tired very easily. Of course, if your podcast is music related, that's a whole different subject. So if you want to promote musicians, that's acceptable. You're welcome.
About the different mentality of podcasts versus other social media.
Yes.
You said it was more direct, more humane.
Yes.
What about when a minister goes as a guest on a podcast? Are there special rules or?
If you are a podcast producer or a podcast host and you have a special guest, such as a minister or a presidential nominee, and you go into a form to serve their agenda, you lost, because it beats the purpose. They will come to the podcast because you are the new age, the new era media. Someone will go to a podcast because it's the medium that will get them closer to the public. So if they're gonna try to form it the way they will do a TV interview, I would say don't do it. So we had that opportunity, during the elections, one of our podcasts, the Pints of Politics that I mentioned before, with the Antonis Polidoro as a host, he invited, and we had not all, we have the four main διεκδικητές of the presidency, Mr. Averov, Mr. Christodoulidis, Mr. Mavroyannis, and Mr. Achilleas Dimitriadis. They all came. Other politicians came as well, and I will mention afterwards, sorry. And that season, the Cyprus elections edition season, was dedicated on high-profile politicians. But we didn't compromise our character, because we told them, you're going to come there, but you're going to go with our rules, or else I don't need to bring you here. Oh, sorry. And yeah, another thing, now that I mentioned the CY Politic Elections Edition, is that we have the podcast, we have the umbrella, it's called Pint of Politics, but we had a specific subject that we wanted to emphasize, so we created a spin-off. That's something that you can always do. Historicon, it's a big podcast, it has more than 100 episodes, it has a big audience, but at some point, Konstantinos Psyllidis, he's a stand-up comedian, he wanted to do interviews, and we told them, okay, yes, but that's not part of the Historicon character. So we created a spin-off, and he called it Conversations. So yeah, you can diversify yourself as much as you want, and you can create categories that fit your needs at any given moment.
So, if a public body is thinking of going into podcasting, have you considered, I mean, like a Black Lemon, possible cooperations in regards to either going into a spin-off or going into existing podcasts that you have?
Yes.
Or even creating a new one? So this is an option for a public body?
Of course.
And in this case, I mean, have you done this before? Or is there an example that someone can refer to in the supervisors and so on, and go in with a proposal and see this is how they did it, yes, and so we can do similar? Because in education, I mean, we, as the pedagogical institute, we are already running various programs and actions. And we even have a program that is dedicated to the European school radio, that is also broadcasted via the internet. So we have schools and teachers and students that are going through the whole process of writing scenarios and making all this stuff. It's not called podcast, but they go through the... So in any case, so this can be done, I mean, between... In order
Easily.
Easily.
The best example is the one that I mentioned with the youth organization. I mean, it's a semi-governmental organization. They came with an agenda. We helped them develop what they kind of already started creating. And we're having a very good collaboration that expanded, as I mentioned before. And that's an example you can show to your supervisors or someone who's going to take the decision to do that kind of productions.
You have analytics on the various audiences, meaning students and also teachers? Or you don't go into the occupation part?
We have age groups, but the age groups analytics, they go as low as 18. Then we have an issue with... Yes,
you have an issue with the consent.
Yes, so we don't know any analytics about under 18. But, for example, we made a live recording of Historicon in a vineyard, doesn't matter. And there was one father that came with his 15-year-old daughter, and he told us, he came afterwards, after the recording, and he told us, I'm here because of my daughter, because she and all of her friends are listening to your podcast and they really wanted to come and meet you guys in person. So there is a lot of people, young people, that listening to podcasts, but for GDPR reasons, we cannot have their analytics, and we don't know.
Even though the age of consent is 15.
Yeah, but it
At least
depends.
for high school, I mean, we could...
It depends on the platforms mostly, like Spotify, etc., that they don't gather the στοιχεία of people, sorry? The data, thank you, yes, of people under 18. Let me find that exactly. But there are big numbers, yeah, here it is. No under 18, any records, any data. But there is a big number on the ages, 18 to 24. So we assume that to have audience at the age of 18, 20, it means that they kind of got introduced to the podcast a bit earlier. But it's also the way you promote it. Like, for instance, it's not a podcast. We don't call it a podcast. It's a show that we did. And it's a dad jokes show. It's called Astana Pan. That we launched it. And we put it like on the platforms that we used to do with all of our other shows. We have an application. We put it on the application. We put it on YouTube. We did some promotional material. We distribute them on Facebook, on Instagram, and it was okay. It did well. But then we decided to cut pieces and create a TikTok account. At this moment, we have 5 million views on TikTok. That's mostly younger generations.
That's my concern. That's right there, because we're going to target, let's say, I mean, lower high school, gymnasium, Lyceum, gymnasium, lyceum. You have to know the media that they are into mostly. So
we're definitely targeting TikTok if we're going to go to that ages. And we're going to have that in mind, that we are targeting TikTok to build the concept and the idea and the format towards that direction. Mm-hmm. Now we are preparing season 2 for that show that I mentioned. Yeah. We're preparing a season 2, and all of the preparation of season 2 is targeted for TikTok, because that's where that audience exists. Yes, please.
Was just please don't, because my son, he's 13 and he loves dad jokes, and he comes to me and see that, and it's a nightmare. But I have a more serious question. How do you choose your host? And you also mentioned earlier about some criteria that you have for
yes.
The people that are invited, that
yes.
are participating, if there are other specific.
No, that's our personal criteria. I mean, there are podcasts out there that they have, that they had as guests people with extreme views that I would never had in my podcast. So that it depends who the producer is. That's our line, and that's the way also that we decide to have a collaboration with one host, one podcast creator. We are not gonna go to a direction that we do not yes, or at least respect. I might disagree with an opinion, but respect it for a reason. But there are opinions that are not respected, so Okay, I'm not going to go there. And the question started for how do we choose our hosts? Actually, they chose us. They come, many people, they come with an idea, I want to do this podcast, and we actually give them the liberty to create their idea, to develop their idea. We give advice, but we want them to create their idea, because if they don't create and they don't start being part of the concept, eventually their interest will fade out. So we want them to be engaged. We want them to be part of the structure of the show that they're gonna host, because we don't want them to lose interest. I don't want to have an idea, I want to do that show and I want you as my host. I'm not doing that. If you have a good idea and we like it and we develop it together, we're going to produce it. I have many ideas for shows and podcasts, but if someone is not excited about it, I'm not just going to assign him or her as a host. And the one thing that we did this year, because there are a lot of individual podcasters that came up, that they are not under a studio umbrella, the ones that we like and that we really believe that they should develop their idea and that they should keep doing their podcast and get easier conditions and they have a bigger access on resources, we approach them. I will contact them, maybe through social media, maybe if I have a common friend, and I'll tell them, I love your podcast, I love what you do, I think there is a lot of potential there. Would you be interested to come on Black Lemon's platform and we will provide for you the resources that you need to keep doing this? So basically, it's a win-win situation because I have on my platform content that I like and they get their hands free to be more creative. They don't have to worry about recording, they don't have to worry about editing, they don't have to worry about distribution, and they do not have to worry about trying to attract sponsors because I will provide that for them. And I'm not giving them that option and expecting payment from them. I mean, if there are young students at the age of 20 or 23 and they're producing their podcast on their own, I'm not gonna go and tell them like, okay, give me 300 euros per episode and I will produce your podcast. I mean, that would be shameful out there to say. So if I believe in the podcast, then and they decide that they wanna come under the Black Lemon umbrella, then it's my responsibility to be able to monetize that podcast, mostly for them. And because we don't expect to have our revenue from the podcast. It's an upcoming thing in Cyprus. Nowadays, a lot of the companies have realized that, and they are, especially in the last couple of months, I had a lot of calls from advertising companies or from private companies that they want to advertise, and they told me, send us your podcast list, send us your analytics, and send us your sponsorship packages, because we want to have a part of our budget absorbed from the TV or radio and throw it into the podcast industry. So yeah,
to follow on that, I mean, you mentioned earlier that you're hosting some podcasts for the youth board, right?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us why did they select you? Or